We are live. Well, welcome to another episode of the Reintroduction Podcast. We are your hosts. My name is Chris Estefanos.
Minus Weird.
And we are stoked to have a second episode with you guys. And, last episode was a little bit controversial. We kind of talked about our experiences with God and some misunderstandings and some misconceptions that we had about Him. And today we're hoping to dig a little bit deeper in some other subject matters. So thank you guys for jumping on another call and being excited about digging deeper into some uncomfortable conversations.
Love it.
Great to be here, guys. What's happening with everybody?
Chilling.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting tired of being in coronavirus mode.
Coronavirus.
We are in quarantine land here.
Prison is rough, man.
It is.
I'm not sure how much longer we can do this, to be honest.
Well, at least we can do a podcast.
Merham, if you're talking to yourself during these circumstances, does that count as mental illness or is it?
Absolutely. I think you should see me and I should bill you immediately. A very, very high rate per hour.
Talk to me after the podcast.
Take Blue Cross Blue Shield, Mina?
No, I don't take no insurance, but invoices are coming your way. If you're hearing this, you're automatically being billed by everything you hear.
You do telehealth?
That's right. Promo on the side. It's just self-promotion. So, I mean, I know we're probably going nuts as much as we possibly can inside, and we could talk about that for a while. But I want to sort of dive right in a little bit, right? In this whole coronavirus situation, one of the things, there have been a couple things that have been hitting the news in all kinds of ways. One of them that I wanted to get your opinion on is there are a bunch of states who are saying, you know what, you guys don't have to worry about whatever stay-at-home order or lock-in-place or social distancing or whatever. If you're a church, if you're an institution of religious background, and a lot of them have gotten this religious exemption. So I wanted to get your take on this. Like, is church essential? Shouldn't we all just be going to church anyway? Isn't this the right thing to do? If you're in one of these states, what would be your take on it? What would be your perspective?
Spicy, right away.
Not to get too
How we go, bro. We got no time to waste.
I think,
and we want to make sure to make other people look bad. Like, if you have a perspective, just make sure to bash other people. Okay, just make fun of them. I'm just kidding.
That's the way it goes.
Yeah.
It comes to mind how we are truly hurt by not having church as a community and as communion and as fellowship. That's two aspects of it. So there's the social aspect and the community aspect of it and the services and everything. Second aspect is communion, which is it's the most essential thing we do in church. And I think about both of these situations in light of the early church. The early church celebrated the Feast of the Resurrection once every 33 years. And they celebrated Holy Week once every 33 years. And I kind of think about that and say to myself, how is it that and when they actually did that, were they able to maintain a true spirit of reverence and worship to God during the years that there was no Holy Week and there was no Feast of Resurrection? So, and if that were to be true, if they were actually able to do that, does that then mean that we can still do it now, even though we can't physically meet in church, that we can still figure out a way to actually do it from our homes?
No, but if they were doing that, I'm sure in the 30 years, like, it wasn't like church was closed. I'm sure, like, they were going to church on some Sundays. They just weren't celebrating the feast.
Yeah, I'm talking more, I guess, about the idea of Holy Week, since we're approaching Holy Week, and then
true.
I think there's two elements here. There is the idea of what I want and the idea of what's good for my neighbor. Right? What I want is, of course, I want to be in church. I want to see my friends. I want to communicate with the community. I want to worship God. I want to I don't want to be in prison anymore, right? So there's that one element. But the second element is me going to church going to cause harm to both myself and to others? Because say we all go into a group, into a church, and we all worship, and we have a fantastic time, but we all come out infecting one another, and then we go out and infect 100 other people, and a bunch of deaths happen. Whose responsibility is that? So I think the onus is on us to really be conscientious and look out for the interests of our neighbors, and be willing to sacrifice a 1 year of Holy Week and 1 year of a few weeks of church where we can actually dig deeper into our relationship with God and build churches at home and build fellowship at home with our families where it's okay. It's okay. We missed a few weeks. It's fine for the betterment of the world. What good is it for a man to go to church and to worship, but to harm his whole entire community?
That sounds real spiritual, Chris. I agree, but doesn't it make sense that if you were to go to church, like obviously we believe that God has some role in this whole thing, right? Isn't God going to protect you if you're the one going to church, whether you're going and taking communion? He's not going to allow you to go with the best of intentions and then take that and then transmit the virus to other people. That would seem kind of backwards.
Yeah, but doesn't that happen? Doesn't that happen usually with other things?
Never. What do you mean?
Doesn't that happen in with other diseases? Let's say, like, and I think we have to separate when we talk about the process of communion and the process of congregating. I think these are two separate things and separate issues. Communion, without a doubt, if we believe that there's the body and blood of Christ, we're not disagreeing on that, and we're not saying that Christ Himself spreads disease. But in the process of going to communion and having communion, you have to be in a place that is closed and confined, sitting next to people on top of each other for 3 whole hours. Some with great hygiene, some with mediocre hygiene, and some with poor hygiene. And that's just the nature of humanity in general, you know? So how can you guarantee? Is
I put on deodorant. I take a shower before I go to church.
I haven't showered in weeks, bro. Thank God for Corona. It's been
lucky
awesome.
I can't smell you from here and verify. But that's I think we have to draw the distinction between the two things. Is that the church congregation, they are people, they are not God. Therefore, yes, they can spread disease, just like you can go to church with a common cold and end up giving it to someone else.
Thou shalt not test the Lord your God.
Amen.
That's my thing. Is if we know that there is a high risk factor in transmitting a virus to each other and to other people, we should be wise stewards of what God has entrusted with us with, which is a mind, and be vigilant. And kudos to our hierarchy and kudos to the church leaders who have canceled church because they recognize that God is not a genie in a bottle that we put on, again, a misconception. We put him on this, like, I'm going to come to church and I'm going to expect that you heal me or you protect me from a virus. It's like saying, God, I'm going to jump into a fire and expect that I'm not going to burn. Remember that old joke, right? The person who was drowning and then he prayed and he said, God, 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 please save me. And the boat came by and he said, no, God's going to save me. A plane came by. He said, no, God's going to save me. And ultimately he ended up dying. And he said, God, where were you? He said, I sent you a plane. I sent you a boat. I sent you people, and you didn't. So, we just have to be smarter about how we consider these factors in relationship with God.
Like where we consider God's intervention. Like God's intervention is not just supernatural.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think the other part of this too is that it's probably important for us also not to look on those other people or churches with judgment. That's why I love what when you guys were saying in the beginning that we have to. This sort of shows that there is a deep yearning for us to be together and to be in church. And I love the classic teaching from St. John Chrysostom, who kind of says that there is truly a little church in the home. And we usually think of that as oh, my home's a little church. Okay, so I'll put an icon somewhere. I'll have a Bible that I'll dust off every now and then. And like you guys are saying, there is this opportunity now for us to reimagine or reevaluate where God is maybe forcing this teaching to be real. Because if it wasn't real before, it's got to be real now. If you don't have a little church in your home, then the weakness of the little church is a weakness of the big church, right? That's the function here.
And also the other thing is, what type of message does this send to non-believing people? Is that if non-believing people are wearing masks on the streets and socially distancing and looking out for the interest of their neighbor, and Christians aren't, come on, man. What kind of... That shows that church is more important than you. Me
Mm.
going and participating in a church service is more important than my neighbor.
That's spicy, Chris. That's a spicy one.
You
Yeah,
know, it's the
it's
reality. That's what we're basically saying by continuing to press into this idea that if I go to church, and the other thing is, there was a church here in DC where a pastor basically contracted the coronavirus and infected his whole congregation. Was
Mm.
God not there to protect him? Was God not intervening at that moment to prevent the whole congregation from getting infected? Of course he
Depends
was.
on the kind of church. Some churches, maybe some churches.
I think we all, and we're all guilty of that, including myself being the first. We like to wear the cloak of martyrdom sometimes when it's unnecessary. Like we make this issue about sacrifice and martyrdom when it really isn't about any of that. Just like you said, God is present, God protects, but we don't need to test it, and we need to also see how He's acting in the natural world and protecting His sons and daughters equally, the Christians and the non-Christians.
So that sort of leads actually to, if it's okay to segue into this part of, if we're thinking of God acting in the natural world and protecting some people and not protecting others. I had someone ask me a very difficult question recently, who works in a hospital in the city, New York City, and is seeing one person die per hour. And one of the patients asked him and said, I'm somewhat of a believing person. Why didn't God protect my uncle? I asked, but he's dead. And there are some, I mean, it's a very morbid topic, but hey, it's Corona time and we got to hit it real hard. We got to talk about it for what it is, because I've seen in hospitals, that I'm around, these like mobile morgues, right? Where like these fridges are pulling up to a hospital, just collecting bodies because of the amount of death that's going on. A natural question that has to come up for people is like, why didn't God stop this? Doesn't he care?
Yeah, the idea, the idea of suffering and the idea of God protecting and taking care of His sons and daughters is, I think, has always been there, and it's something that is not just Christians in the early times, but in Judaic tradition and people of the Old Testament, they have kind of had the same thought process. You look at the Old Testament and you see that suffering in the beginning was understood as something that is in direct correlation um, with deeds and your actions. If you've done bad things, you get punished for it. That's where
Right.
suffering comes. And then, not only until basically towards the end, and where we see the story of Job, does that understanding slightly starts to change, where you see the idea of there is something as the suffering of the innocent or innocent suffering, that something might happen to you that is not necessarily because of your own actions. And even in the story of Job, you've had his friends and come up to him and say, like, what did you do to bring all this on your head? And it wasn't like that. And he kept on saying it wasn't. So it was only natural, even for people in first century Israel and Judea, to expect that when Christ came, that he would alleviate all suffering, but we don't see any of that happen. And one of the most fundamental ideas of Christianity is that Christ comes to suffer with, not to take away suffering.
Well, I think we need to backdrop from this. Like I think we need to rewind and figure out, where did sickness and disease and suffering all come into play, right? The Christian
Walmart.
understand, huh?
Walmart primarily.
The Christian understanding of it starts from the fall, right? Like it starts from this idea that God created man, gave man the freedom and the potential to choose life and death. And man chooses death. And when he chooses death, disease, corruption, death enters into the world, right? And I think if you separate that reality from the current experience, you're missing a part of it, right? Like we know that disease exists in the world because of the fall. Now the particularities of who it impacts, that's where we don't really know. We can't understand the why.
But that's a tough question, right? Because even what Mina said is Christ didn't come to eliminate suffering, right? He came to sort of suffer with us, right? That he was like us in all things except for sin alone, and that he had this, like the depth of the human experience fully. But There were some people who were lucky enough where their suffering was alleviated. You were born blind, but you're not blind anymore. You were paralytic, but you're walking around tap dancing.
But that's what I'm trying to say is the particularity of each experience. That's where we don't know how and why at certain moments and times interventions happen, and sometimes they don't, right? Like, I don't know why God chose to heal the blind man when Christ came and entered and into our world and into our existence, and maybe there were others that weren't healed. He didn't
Yeah,
heal
well,
every single person that walked on the earth at the same time that he walked this planet,
mm,
right?
No, he didn't.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and in that particular story, it says that for the Son of Man to be glorified. So in that situation, that was the reason given. Other situation, you don't see any reasons given for it. And it's the question that we always ask when we talk about even the stories of the Old Testament, is that even the difficult stories of the Old Testament, we always say, let's try to and look at it from a Christological standpoint. Like, where is Christ in this story? Where is God in the story of the Old Testament? And today it's no different. Whether the suffering we're talking about is COVID or anything else, we can easily say, okay, where is God in this story? Is he up in the sky directing punishment or watching or just like passive, or is he actually here with us, going through this with us, and and holding our hand through the whole experience?
Yeah, because I think whether we like it or not, suffering and pain and hardship is indiscriminate, right? You go to a hospital and it's not like there are is one section for the bad people that are sick and one section for the good people that get better, right? Like it
Right.
doesn't work like that. So pain is indiscriminate, right? And every single person at some point in their life will face hardship. Now, does that mean that, the favor of God isn't upon that person? What do you guys think?
I don't think so, because I think part of what you're saying that's important too is even in this middle of this whole COVID thing is like you alluded to, like there are priests who passed away, like we see in Italy, right? There are people who we presume to be righteous. Obviously, we don't know, like their heart or whatever. Um, but that there really is different. I mean, even Tom Hanks got COVID. Like, I mean, of all people, like Mr. Rogers got COVID. I mean, that's the biggest tragedy I think of all
Catholic
time.
part too.
That's right, man. That's gonna be really cast real far away. Um, so there's that part that it's indiscriminate, and there's that part that I think is hits everybody. But then even another piece that sort of hits home for me is that sometimes people frame this question as if it's like a big world kind of question, like why is there suffering everywhere? But for a lot of people, I really believe that the question is really why is there suffering for me? That's the heart of it. I'm not as concerned about why is the guy in China, why did that happen to him, but for me because and part of what like I like what Mina said too of feeling like I don't want to be alone in my suffering. I don't want to feel like and I think we might have alluded to this in a different episode of that they've even measured like the impact of that on you physically when you believe that you're alone in your suffering in the hospital, for example, and that God is somehow against you in your suffering, and that makes you more sick physically makes you more sick. So there's a
Mm.
transformational opportunity there for me personally in my suffering, for Christ being present there, in addition to me understanding of, well, where did this all come from? This didn't all come from the fact of like, oh, out of thin air or because some dude caused it. There is there's a way that you can track this.
Yeah, some way. I mean, when we talk about the whole COVID situation, I guess because this is the most recent example that alludes to suffering in our life as a collective society, we'll have people who are divided across the board on why this is happening, from the clergy, from atheists, from thinkers, from simple people. Everyone has his own opinion, and a lot of them seem to clash. I mean, is it punishment or is it not? And one way that I personally think about it, and this is my personal opinion, is that where is the punishment component in COVID-19, for example? Is it the fact that people are dying from it? Well, I mean, poverty kills way more people than COVID has. Is it the fact that people are suffering during the disease process? Maybe, but people have cancer all the time and they suffer so much more. Is it financial bankruptcy? But again, it hasn't affected everyone the same. There are some people who are pretty much unaffected, and there's some others who can't find food for the next day. So that's why personally I find it difficult to say directly, yeah, it's cut clear. This is punishment. And I think for me, we might disagree on why it's happening, or is it punishment, is it not punishment? But the one thing that's clear is that God allowed it because he has full control. And if he allowed it, not necessarily dictated it, but if he allowed it, then why? And for me, I believe the answer to that question cannot be a collective answer. We cannot say he allowed it because the world needs, maybe. I mean, we can always say, yeah, generally speaking, we can say there's so much evil in the world. Yes. So maybe he had done. But I think the more lesson to be learned here is, what does it mean for me individually? I think the answer to why, it's individual. Because for me, maybe that means that I was taking communion for granted and I wasn't, living it out the way I needed. Maybe for one of you guys, it meant that you're not spending enough time with your family and you needed to spend more time, and that's why you're locked at home. I think for all of us, if we dig deep, then you could find the answer of why did God allow this in this time, and what can I learn from it, without completely dismissing the fact that it is happening for our discipline, and there is a huge component of repentance that is always in front of us, that we should always see things through, whether it's punishment and fear. Repentance comes before fear all the time, all day.
But I'm going to interject here for a second. I'm going to ask you, do you think that God would kill 10,000 people for the sake of teaching a few people a lesson?
No.
Or for you to learn your own personal lesson from this experience?
This is the part that I think I'm going to answer for Mina, because I don't know which Mina you were talking to. I'm sure Mina's spiritual. I'm going to use the Mina card. Even though the way that you're putting it, Mina, I think is really wise and is like a good personal interpretation. The problem that I have, the beef with this line of thinking, and again, nothing against whoever is thinking that way, they're just wrong. It's not a big deal. I'm just kidding, right? But it's like, what happens there is Chris's question sort of becomes the non-believer question. It's like, okay, so we're just all gonna die so you can learn a lesson. YouTube it, bro. Like, did we really have to suffer through an ICU so that you can spend more time with your mom? Like, just
took my grandma away from me so you could learn to spend more time with your family?
Yeah, like, that's not my problem. Figure that out for yourself. And even worse is if, like, oh, okay, some people will make that generalization and say, yes, this is the reason it's being done for everybody, because there is a collective issue. And as much as, like, same way when you're raising kids, I imagine when you're a kid, you get this perception from somebody older that try to make you fall in line by fear or try to motivate you by love. And I think when people are using more and more fear and making God scarier and scarier, when he already looks so scary to so many people, it really annoys me. It really, whether or not the theological thinking is sound or the scriptural references are the best, but the more we make God scary, I think the less helpful it is for us to approach him. I don't think that makes us want to repent more. I really don't.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I don't disagree with that, because my chain of thought, or basically the way I'm thinking about it, is kind of in the same line as, okay, if this is meant as a collective lesson, then why is it killing the elderly, even though they are not the most sinful? I mean, some of them could be, but they're not they're not the group that you think about when you're thinking of communal sin of the world today. So yeah, I agree. I think,
what do you mean they ruined the environment?
Yeah, it is.
Florida, bro.
Yeah, it is a hard lesson. But sorry, I don't mean it as a lesson as in God is teaching us and he's doing it deliberately. I think there's a natural course of action. Part of it is free will. People do things that they choose willingly to do that sometimes they suffer for it personally, and sometimes the collective society has to pay the price for it. But the fact that God is suffering with us and the fact that he is here and tangible can speak to me on a personal level on how I can personally reconcile with this and come out of it stronger. Not saying that it happens so I can do this.
Well, let's go down this train of thought for a second, because this is how I sort of work through it. right? So let's just say, because there's a lot of talk and rumor around where coronavirus started, right? So let's just say it started from a wet market in Wuhan, right? Where they were filleting a bat or eating some rare, animal, and somehow the virus was transmitted from an animal to a human. That person then went on to infect a whole other bunch of other people, right? My question is, where did God come into the mix of this to be blamed? Like, who told the person to fillet a bat and to splay? Like, people don't eat bats. I mean, just like logically, like I forget
Batman.
it's weird. It's a weird thing, but the reality is like these rare animals are known. Bats, for example, are known to have viruses. Why take that particular animal if that is the way that this was transmitted?
It was
And
delicious.
hmm?
It
It
was
might be
delicious.
delicious. You haven't had it. You never know.
so so
Delicacy.
then humans have brought about a disease into the world, and God now is working with this disease, not in the fact that he's maybe allowing it, because if he interjects in this moment, he has to interject in every moment where man does something dumb, right?
Exactly.
And if he interjects in this, and this goes back to the idea of human freedom, right? So that's where I struggle with the narrative of pointing the blame back on God. I think God is actually trying to bring healing to what humans have done by using this for good, helping people discover vaccines, medical practitioners getting more invested in patient care. There's just been so much good that's come out of this, and I think that's where God should be pointed at.
Right.
Absolutely. But that's
I
why, like, I started my chain of thought by saying, where is God in the story? Is he up in the
right.
sky directing punishment, or is he here with us seeing all of it through? Because this whole thing, if not the entirety of it, started because of a free will of a man's action, and you can also say because one government chose to not to act fast enough, and it kind of spread to everybody. So there's a huge human component that is free to choose in the way that it does choose. And if we're going to single this out and say this is the only punishment, and what about the last 15 pandemics? And what about the earthquakes and the natural disasters and everything else that happens? So yeah,
That's why I'm saying the only way that I reconcile it is that there is a natural disorder in the world that's happening now as a result of the fall, and God has already healed humanity, right? Like for us as Christians, our narrative is very different than the rest of the world's is. Like for us as Christians, death is not a punishment. Death is a transition to a place far greater, right? So for the Christian, the idea that this is a punishment if I die, that's a crazy conversation because we believe in the resurrection of the dead. For the non-Christian, I understand this conversation, but you don't believe in God to begin with to point the finger at him.
mm,
So you see where my struggle is like if you don't believe in God, how are you going to point the finger at him? If you believe in God and you believe in the Christian perspective of God, how can you say that if you do die that this is a punishment from God?
mm,
If you're healed, there's something good that maybe God is trying to, or some lesson that he's trying to work or spare you from something. And if you go, that means maybe you're ready. I don't know.
mm.
But that's the misconception, right? That's why we're blessed to have this podcast kind of conversations, because it's not so much that people don't believe in God and point to him, but it's that people might have like a loosey goosey kind of understanding about God. It's like maybe God is there, and if he is, then he's the vengeful type. Then he's salty. Then he's bitter about my lifestyle, or he's bitter about whatever. And maybe there is that part that you guys were alluding to. Like there is a part for us to look in the mirror and say, like, what is it that I can do differently or whatever. But for us to understand who God is actually in this whole thing,
Mm.
and I love the way that you put it, both in the story of first originally, like when this all started, how we were created for something beyond this, that we were in this perfect, beautiful sort of state that we fell from, and we can't blame him for that. Can't blame him for our fall, and then we can't blame him for the consequences of our fall that's happening right now either, or the fact that we're continuing to fall. That's fair.
Yeah, I think it's in politics. There's a saying in politics or finance or one of these things that says, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's what this is about. And every like entrepreneur and like anyone who's built a company from the ground up will tell you that using the downtimes to your advantage is your biggest strength. So that's kind of like where we're at. Okay, now whether like let's say you're not convinced, like you're the listener, you're not convinced by anything we're saying and you're still convinced it's a punishment. Well, regardless of like where you stand on the issue, the fact that remains is we are in this now and we're going through it. What are we going to learn from it, and how are we going to come out of it, and how are we going to use this time to our advantage as a society and as a church and as individuals?
And I think that's where we have to go back to the character of God. That
Yeah.
God is long suffering, He's merciful, He's abundant in His mercy, forgiving iniquity, like as far as the east is from the west, right? Like God is 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 plenteous in His desire to like shower man with love, right? So if that's the baseline of how I perceive God, that's like my view of Him, then any circumstance that happens to me in life, I know is for my betterment. And I have a choice in every situation that when a hardship happens to me, I can experience pain, but I don't have to suffer. And there's a huge difference between the two, right? I can experience a ton of pain. I can get coronavirus, and I can, in the middle of coronavirus, be coughing up my brains and be feeling terrible. And I could still be thanking God, knowing that maybe there was something that by receiving this virus, there was something that I needed to learn, right?
Yeah, and that points to one other thing that's sort of misunderstood greatly. If the person watching or listening is not familiar with the Orthodox Church, but there's a sacrament that we have called the unction of the sick, right? And in that unction, the goal that's the actual function of it is to be able to meet Christ, to commune with Him in our pain, like you're saying, Chris, and not have it be a wasted moment of pain, but it's really like a portal of pain. Like in that pain, you can see the person of Christ, and that's why it's successful every time we do the unction. But people misunderstand it. If you've seen like from a movie, right,
It's
the
magic.
unction, it's magic. Maybe the person will get better, or it's a last resort and it means nothing. Person's gonna die, right? You see the priest coming into their ICU, anointing their head because they're gonna die, and that's the end of it. But for us, really, that sacrament points to how we understand the difference, like you're saying, Chris, between pain and suffering, is that Christ physically is communing with us in our pain. And that's the opportunity of this whole coronavirus. And again, we go back to like, God is not some magic guy in the sky. God is the image of the invisible God is Christ Jesus. And Christ Jesus came and was present in that pain in a real way, in a real one on one kind of way, and not in a way that's like judgmental and pointing and wrathful and throw things at you, but in a way that like, I'm in the trenches with you.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge that we all have to sort of look to within, right? Is like I have a choice in every hardship that I encounter in life, either to be the victim or to be the victor,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's what I would encourage all of our listeners and our viewers to sort of think about how you are experiencing this whole coronavirus experience. Like, what's your go to? Is your go to be the victim? Is your go to figure out in this time period how I can look past my current self and my current experience and figure out ways to bless others, right? Because that's what God did. He entered into our brokenness to heal us and to bless us and to give us, the ability to thrive. I have come so they can have abundant life, right? um so I guess, for all of us, I mean, this was a powerful conversation, for us to sort of even self-evaluate and think about how do I approach this, and how do I, reconcile these issues. And I don't I know for you guys, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think the more and more we stop attributing negative attributes to God in relationship to things that happen in the world, the more that He has an opportunity to reintroduce Himself to us.
Facts.
Amen to that.
Represent.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for another fantastic episode of the reintroduction. Tune in next time. We will have way more spicy conversations to be had, and looking forward to hearing from all of you in our contact us page on the website. Check out our social media. We're on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. We're on everything. Check us
That's right.
out.
Don't forget
And
to subscribe, please.
subscribe. Don't unsubscribe like last week.
China. China. Nina, say China, please.
China.
China.
All right, guys.
Peace out.
Peace.